Melina is also presenting the next talk, so we stay in the area of language development and word learning, and in Texas, but there was also the Rice University in Houston involved, and now you would talk about the role of attention to non-target objects during object labeling. Okay, maybe we give again a
Thanks. Yeah. Well, thanks for bearing with me one last time. I'm presenting this work on behalf of co-authors who can't be here today. And actually, some of this is maybe related to the question that came up earlier. So hopefully that addresses some of that as well. The goal of this work was really to look at how attention to non-target objects might serve as this really important overlooked input for word learning. So of course, language learning is a pretty remarkable feat of early development, but unlike large language models that are trained on extensive data, children by the age of 13 hear less than 100 million words. And this observation has also sort of ignited challenges like the Baby LM challenge. Children can nonetheless sort of achieve extraordinary command of their language despite this limited input. And one particularly impressive achievement is the ability to learn words. So by 2 years of age, children are mapping lots of words, they show a more robust vocabulary, and they can also learn how words are meaningfully connected to one another as well. And all of this despite seemingly sort of limited perceptual, cognitive, and social abilities. This is all the more impressive because word learning is a computationally challenging task, because when a child hears a word, they might see many different references in view. This is something known as referential uncertainty, and figuring out how children overcome referential uncertainty has really been the crux of a lot of empirical research as well as theoretical debates in early language development research. In our lab in the past, we've used head-mounted eye tracking to understand referential uncertainty from the perspective of the infant. And so what we've been able to do is to look at what percentage of time when a parent names an object, the child is actually looking at the object that's being named versus other objects that are present in the environment. And what this work has shown is that in about 1/3 of instances, children spend sort of 100% of the time when parents are naming it, attending to that object. So we're going to call that the target object. In 1/3 of the instances, they attend to a completely different object, which we're going to call the non-target object. And then the remaining instances, it's sort of a combination of the two. And so this poses two main questions. The first is, how do children learn words from this bimodal distribution? And then secondly, what role does attention to these non-target objects play for word learning, given that children are spending a lot of time attending to other objects? And so one way in which children might learn words from this bimodal distribution is because they can rely on cross-situational learning. I already described this in my previous talk, so you see a common theme. But what this mechanism also implies is that children are tracking additional statistical co-occurrences between words and these non-target objects. And so what we take, so usually or traditionally in the literature, this attention to non-target objects during naming has been viewed as a hindrance to word learning. But we take a novel perspective and say that this attention to non-target objects might serve as really important overlooked input for learning. And I'm going to explain what we mean by that. So to answer this question, we just want to quantify how children attend to target and non-target objects during an everyday interaction. And in this case, we're looking at shared book reading. And the reason we chose shared book reading is that parents are naming a lot of objects, but at the same time, these storybooks often contain several semantically related objects, and it's also a very dynamic and visually complex interaction. So it really makes it an ideal context to think about the kinds of input statistics that are being generated during these during sort of everyday interactions. And we used book reading to look at two aims. The first was to just quantify how children are distributing their attention to these objects. And then secondly, to assess whether attention to non-target objects might provide some important statistical regularities that children can use to support their building of word knowledge. So to address this, we had 36 parents contribute 82 book reading sessions. So they had about 10 to 15 minutes to read as many books as they liked. We removed all the text just to ensure that parents would elicit spontaneous narratives. Again, this will look very familiar to you. They read these books in our home lab, so we had a third-person view, but then we importantly also measured where parents and infants were looking moment to moment during this interaction. We again coded where children were looking and what parents were saying. And this led to this temporal data stream of where children were looking moment to moment to different objects on the page. So these different colors refer to the different objects that were present. We can then also temporally align parents' speech and identify the moments where they name objects on the book page. And so our first question was to quantify to what degree children are actually attending to the objects that parents are naming during book reading. And so we took all the utterances where parents mentioned one of the objects, defined a 3-second window from the onset of that utterance, and then identified the percent of time that children looked to the correct object that was being named in that time window. So on your right, you're going to see an example of the parent naming the boy and the child attending almost the entire time. But in other instances, children are rarely looking at that object. That might look something like this. The parent names the boy, but the child is already moving to the next page. We can then plot the percent time that children looked at these different objects during that naming window as a histogram. And what you'll notice in comparison to the bimodal distribution I showed you earlier is that in book reading, in over half of the cases, infants are attending less than 10% to the object. So that is, they rarely attend to the named target object in the shared reading interaction. But of course, parents aren't just naming the object once. They're naming this object repeatedly across the entire narrative. So maybe if on the first page they name the boy and the child attends to the cat, the log, and the basket, they might sort of accumulate comparable statistical evidence across all these different objects. But as parents begin to name the boy more frequently across the book, they might accumulate more evidence for the correct word-object mapping. So that is, they're spending more time looking at that boy object in comparison to any of the other objects in the book. So let's look at what that looks like in our actual data. I'm going to use 2 examples from 2 of our books. So it's Goodnight Gorilla and I Went Walking. And what you'll notice here, and those hot spots along the diagonal, so these are instances where children spent more time looking at the object that was being named. But what you'll also notice in book reading is that children are also, in many instances, attending comparably or even more to one of these non-target objects. Another way in which we can quantify that is that for each object that parent named, we can just count the number of different competing objects that they attended to. And if we plot that as a histogram, we see that for some words, they're only looking at that object and none of the other competing objects, whereas for others, they're attending to as many as 17 different competing objects across the book reading interaction. So the key question that we were interested in is, given that children are spending a lot of time looking at these other objects during book reading, what might the role of these objects play in children's learning? And if we compare that to a matrix that looks something like this, where we only have those diagonal cells highlighted, it's pretty obvious that in that case, the learner would have sort of an easy time building the correct word-object mappings, because they're getting sort of the clearest statistical evidence for that correct word-object mappings. And this matrix on the right would be ideal if the only sort of goal of the learner was to acquire word-object mappings. But what we suggest is that attention to both target and non-target objects enables learners to sort of extract several different statistical regularities that they can use to build word and semantic knowledge. So we're still in the process of making sense of this, so I'd also love your feedback on sort of how we're proposing to think about it. But I'm going to illustrate this in a toy example of just 2 words and 2 objects. So what we suggest is that if children are attending to several different objects when they're hearing these words, they might learn object similarity based on the fact that, for instance, dog and cat have similar word co-occurrences. They might also learn word similarity, this is what I showed you in the previous study, based on the fact that these words are heard while attending to similar objects. So all this might be used to build some semantic knowledge. At the same time, we also suggest that this enables children to also infer new or partially learned word-object mappings. So let me explain what I mean by that. So let's say they accumulate the most statistical evidence for this word-object mapping. They also hear the word cat in the presence of the dog. They learn the similarity between these 2 objects and words based on their shared co-occurrences. And they also hear the word dog in the presence of the cat. Might this whole system of associations actually allow them to more efficiently infer that mapping that they have the least statistical evidence for? Okay, this is how we're thinking about this. I'd love your feedback on it. But of course, what I'm assuming here is that when children are not attending to the object that's being named, they're attending to an object that's semantically similar. And so we want to probe that in our actual data. So we identified all the objects on the page and computed their semantic similarity using ConceptNet. And then we identified when a parent named an object, what objects children attended to that weren't the named object, so in this case the cat and the horse, and what objects they did not attend to, so in this case the cow and the bag. And then we computed the semantic similarity between those items and the object that parents named. And what we found here is that the objects that children attended to that weren't the named object were more semantically similar to the objects that they did not attend to, okay? So what this suggests is that this attention to non-target objects might provide these really useful semantic regularities. But beyond these semantic regularities, book reading also provides temporal regularities that you can read more about in the proceedings paper, because of course infants aren't just attending to what parents are naming, parents are also naming what children are attending to. And so what we noticed in moments when a parent named, let's say, the horse, and the child was predominantly looking at the cow, that the parent was actually more likely to name the cow within 10 seconds after. And that actually extended children's attention to that item. So what this again suggests is that book reading and this attention to non-target objects might provide both semantic as well as temporal regularities that are useful for learning. So really taken together, the goal of this work was to understand how children build word knowledge flexibly from their limited everyday input. Traditionally, we've assumed that attention to non-target objects is a hindrance to learning, but we suggest that children might also be using attention to these non-target objects to build word knowledge more flexibly. We think that cross-situational learning might be a solution to how children extract these different regularities that serve two learning goals. They serve to learn individual word object mappings, but then also broader semantic knowledge. So with that, I'd like to thank the authors of this work. Okay.
So thanks again, and I think we should take time for one or two questions. Yes? Mm-hmm.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I would like to know if you checked if there are connections in any direction, like positive or negative, with the novelty of the non-target objects. So if there is a relation to the fact that, apart from the semantic similarity and so on, if there is something that was never seen before or was seen before, if this is related to the fact that...
it's a good question. We don't have any measure of the novelty of these items for the children, but what we have looked at, what we have looked at is the object size, of course, because larger objects on the page are going to draw children's attention, and that certainly plays a role in children's sort of attention allocation. But beyond that, again, we also see that they tend to look at semantically related objects as well. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So there are more questions now. Yeah, on that side. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much for the talk. I was just thinking, like, whether you also looked into the use of negations in the context, because at the same time, when you use negation to negate some object, you are essentially not referring to the object, but also at the same time referring to the distractor, right?
Yeah.
Which you intend to impart about, right? So just thinking, like, whether you also looked.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. We haven't looked at parents' speech in a fine-grained way like that. So if they're saying, like, oh, there's a dog, oh, that's not the cat. Yeah, we could look at that data, but currently we've only focused on, okay, is this a moment where they're naming that object? But that's a very interesting question. There's more we can dig into in parent speech. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then
my question, I have kind of two parts, if that's okay. My first question was related to the first one. If you have any measure of vocabulary prior to the task, because I wonder if that would be also driving, whether they have, if building from what you said initially, if they don't know the word for a certain object, they would focus on that for some of them, but also building other knowledge for objects they already know. The second part would be, when you mentioned temporal dynamics, I was thinking a little bit more about that predicting what is happening next in the story, more than what the parent would be anticipating from the child's behavior. Would you, do you have any predictions of, for example, the story is mentioning cow now, but I'm predicting that the next object will be dog, so I'm going to look anticipating dog.
Yeah. Okay, so yes, those are great questions. To your first point, so we do have information in our toy play experiment of what words children are familiar with. And I wasn't able to talk about this today, so I'm glad that you asked. What was interesting is that for items that are unfamiliar to children, parents were more likely to name just name that object. But for objects that were less familiar to the children, they were actually more likely to use other words that were semantically related to that object. And I don't think that this is like an explicit, I don't necessarily think parents are consciously thinking of it in that way, but it's almost like parents are sort of automatically creating really useful input that starts sort of with building word-object mappings and then sort of extending that to sort of accrue additional semantic information about the objects. But we don't have that information for book reading. We have some information about whether they've read the books before, so that gets to your second question about anticipatory looks. It's possible that we haven't looked at anticipatory looks, but it's possible that children are doing that, especially in books where sort of the ordering of the object is also left to right on the page and is sort of repeated across several pages. We haven't looked at that, but certainly should.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So, and after so much food for the mind, some of you might now crave for food for the body, and so let's take this short stroll to the Blocks restaurant, continue our discussion, and be back at 2 for the next symposium. Thanks to all the speakers.